Hello! Welcome back, everybody, to the Carpenter Critique. My name is Luke Carpenter. I am your host, and I'm so glad to have you here. This is our 22nd episode, I'm pretty sure. What? I can't believe I've done 22 episodes! Yes, I'm so glad for everybody that's been a part of this journey. This has been such a great time. I've gotten to engage with a bunch of different people about TV shows and movies that everybody is passionate about. Actually, this week has been such an interesting week because I just posted about The Odyssey. So I did a review of The Odyssey and a think piece done specifically about The Odyssey last week. I received so many hate comments about me calling the Lestrygonians knights. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry, they're not knights. Obviously, I know that, but like, why did everybody have to call me out? And just received more hate comments in general. I don't know, it made me feel like, oh, I made it. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've made it. I just had like a few more views than I normally do, but I was like, wow, I've made it. The hate comments just fuel that ego that I've been needing for this podcasting, so you know what? I'll take it. I'll take the hate comments. Also, I mean, when artists open up their space, like when directors put out a movie or when anyone puts out a TV show, it's like you're opening it up for critiques. It's art is meant to be seen and art is meant to be critiqued. Some art you just want to keep to yourself, but I'm really glad that I can open up my podcast for my thoughts and engagements with the media. And that also means I do the same for everybody. So of course everybody's not going to agree with me, and of course we all have our own opinion, and I totally respect it. Please bring on the comments. I'm honestly just glad that I got more engagement and more people are paying attention to what movies are coming out. And yeah, I just want it to be fun though. I don't want any hate comments spread, really, truly. No hate on anyone else. Of course, if you disagree with my opinion, absolutely tell me. I would love to know why. Honestly, I really would. And part of me doing this podcast is so I can hear everybody's opinions on the shows and the movies. So please hit me with your hot takes, hit me with your new opinions. I'm ready for it. Even if you don't like mine, we can totally have a discussion about it anyway. So, that being said, I'm actually going to talk about a very controversial show today. Game of Thrones. Whoa! If you haven't seen Game of Thrones, where have you been? But also, it is the 15-year anniversary this year. Game of Thrones originally was created in 2011, and now it is 2026. Crazy. The show spanned 9 years. The last season was in 2019. So from 2011 to 2019, Game of Thrones was one of, if not the most popular show on the internet and in the world. So HBO really ate with Game of Thrones. Now they have House of the Dragon, another very, very popular show. But today we're just going to go over Game of Thrones. I rewatched all 8 seasons before this episode. So, what? I definitely took a journey with the characters. I've seen it once before. I'd seen it when it all came out for season 8. I watched it all up until when season 8 came out, and then I was able to watch every week. And so I wasn't on the train for all the hate at first. I was just kind of like an observer and realizing what everybody was thinking. It didn't seem that off to me, like that much different than the rest of the series, and so part of why I wanted to go back and rewatch it was to be like, did I really hate the ending, or was it just like everybody else's opinion chiming in? So, spoiler alert, if you have not seen Game of Thrones in the last 15 years or ever, I will be going over all of the finales, not every storyline, but as many storylines as I can cover in the next 20 minutes. So, please bear with me. So, spoiler alert, if you have not seen any of it and you don't want it spoiled for you, I would recommend not listening to the next 20 minutes. But if you are ready to have it spoiled, I mean, it has been out for quite a while, so I mean, maybe, it's fine. Just spoil it, it's fine. Also, I doubt you're going to be able to remember the names of the characters. Anyway. Okay, so Game of Thrones is a fantasy series. It takes place in a fictional world of Westeros, the fictional land of Westeros. To set the scene, there's a bunch of different characters, and the Iron Throne, or the Big Throne, is of all 7 kingdoms in the land. So everybody's kind of vying for it, everybody has a different claim for it, blah, 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 blah. We start off with the Stark family, and more or less Game of Thrones is about how the Starks work their way through Westeros, what happens to them and their family, but there's a bunch of different other characters and houses as well, but House Stark is more or less the main characters of the show. Now, my favorite character is Arya Stark. Start to finish, she's my girl. I love you, Arya. I love you, Arya. I love Maisie Williams, the actress that portrays her. I was definitely taken on a journey in this second time watching it, because I remember in the first time watching it, there was a lot of storylines that I didn't really care for. I think Theon being tortured by Ramsay throughout like 3 seasons worth, I was like, okay, enough. And then Sansa just couldn't get a win. But then I'm starting to realize part of Game of Thrones is just like everybody gets beaten down, or killed. It's just a bunch of suffering. We're watching all these characters suffer in different ways. There's very rarely happy moments in Game of Thrones. And so I'm wondering why it's so addicting, why everybody was so invested in all of the characters. And part of the reason why I'm going into the psychology study today is because why were we just addicted to watching people suffer in the fictional world of Westeros? Now, I do think the first 6 seasons of Game of Thrones are very similarly paced. I think, so some backstory. Game of Thrones is based on a book series by George R.R. Martin. The first 4 seasons are directly correlated with the books. In season 5 is when the showrunners strayed away from the books and also went in a different direction with a lot of the characters, but basically got notes from George R.R. Martin to see where he had intended these characters to go. I don't think we notice a pacing issue in the show until season 7, actually. That's when it speeds up, everything speeds up, and we kind of get all these payoffs in the different ways. So throughout Game of Thrones, we're following a bunch of different storylines. We're following the Lannister storyline with Cersei in King's Landing and all of her children as they ascend the Iron Throne. Joffrey, Tommen, and also her daughter Marcella being shipped off to the city of Dorne. We also have Jaime Lannister, who is a knight who ends up getting his hand cut off because he falls in love with a different knight. Brienne of Tarth! Love you, Brienne of Tarth. And then all the Starks end up getting split up, the parents end up killed, and we see how each child tries to grow into their own without their parents and in this really harsh world of Westeros. But that all happens in the first 6 seasons, and then we don't even see our characters really end up meeting each other. Cersei is off with all the people in King's Landing, and the Starks have kind of been separated throughout Westeros. So Arya is traveling, trying to get back to Winterfell, and Sansa is being moved. She's more or less what it means to be a woman in Westeros and be a girl. And so she's sold off to marry different lords throughout the series. She marries Tyrion, who is a Lannister. She also marries Ramsay Bolton. For those who... I'm just jogging all your memories. And then she ends up as Queen of the North in Winterfell, which is the Stark's home. Now, we don't even get all these rewards of seeing the characters go through all this suffering really until season 7. Season 7 is when all of the payoffs start happening, so all the Starks finally come back together. Daenerys, who has been our queen long across the ocean, doesn't even come to Westeros until season 7, when she meets Jon Snow. And so it's hard for me to say because a lot of my favorite storylines happen within season 7 and 8, but those are often seen as the worst parts of the series, and I understand what people are saying when they say that. I do think the pacing immediately speeds up. Our characters throughout the first 6 seasons of Game of Thrones are going on these long journeys to travel between cities. And season 7 and 8, the characters seem to just travel between the cities at no time at all. It's like one scene they're in Winterfell, the next season they're down south in King's Landing. Which I know that is a big critique from a lot of people. I don't really care about the traveling. Like, do I really need to see them travel? To me, not really. But my issue is the timeline. They're like, oh, it's a few days down to King's Landing. Well, we spent weeks in season 2 going through this travel from King's Landing to Winterfell. It just, the timelines don't add up, which that is a bit buggy to me. But I will say in season 7 is finally when the series starts to get a little bit happy and we start to get hope that things might work out. Whereas most of Game of Thrones is like, if you have a little bit of hope, dash it. Because we don't want any hope in Westeros. Like, for instance, the big episode, The Red Wedding. Our main storyline with Robb Stark leading the pack against the Lannister army. Robb Stark is killed, beheaded, and a wolf's head is put onto his head and paraded through the streets. That is the pinnacle episode of Game of Thrones. So what are we doing as a humanity? Like, why are we so addicted to the show? Me being also addicted to the show. Why are we addicted to watching people suffer? And then when it finally gets good and happy, everybody starts hating the show. Everybody hated season 7. Understandably because of those little timeline things, but also it's kind of like, finally we're seeing this payoff. We have this big world of Westeros. They've been creating all these different storylines and making the world so big. And then when it comes to an end, they have to wrap up all these storylines. And it was a bit rushed. I will say they didn't spend the time that they needed to. The writers didn't spend the time that they needed to speed up the storylines. However, I don't think season 7 deserves all the hate that it gets. I think there is so many good moments, like when the Starks reunite, like when Arya kills Walder Frey and gets justice for the Red Wedding, like we finally see Daenerys and Jon Snow meet, and it's really cute, actually. I think they should have spent more time with it, of course, and built up the romance, but I really liked them meeting. And then she turns out to be his aunt, and it's like, why are you making out with your aunt? But that's a whole other story. Like, why were they setting up this big romance and then it ends up being a nephew and his aunt? Why do you want me to root for that? Why are you asking me to root for a nephew falling in love with his aunt? And I do. But we have to move on. If your aunt was Daenerys Targaryen, you're telling me you're not going to fall in love with her, and she looked like that, and she's Emilia Clarke in the blonde-ass wig, I'm absolutely falling in love with my aunt Daenerys Targaryen. Absolutely I am. But I don't want to, but I will. And I did. But anyway, so like that season 7 is pretty rushed, but also I feel like a lot of the good and more hopeful storylines come out of season 7. So that's my hot take, is season 7 doesn't deserve all that hate that it got. Season 8, however... Okay, so season 8 is the penultimate final season of Game of Thrones. Now, I know the writers were actively working on finishing season 8 so that they could work on the last Star Wars movie, which they also butchered, but this episode isn't about that. In season 8, we see it's only down to 6 episodes, whereas most of the seasons have been 8 or 10 episodes. So already we're starting off weird. Then, we have the final battle against the dead in one episode. Episode 3 is the final battle. And honestly, through episode 3, I think is a really great projection of what the final season, what they were working towards. I think those first 3 episodes are solid. That war episode is by far the best one. Episode 3, even watching the whole series through, that episode against the living versus the dead, by far the best war episode. I like that better than Battle of the Bastards. I like that better than the Battle of King's Landing. Easily, in my opinion, the best one. When we see the dragons fight, the Night Dragon versus Daenerys' dragon, so good. When we see Jon Snow fighting all those guys, so good. We see Arya working her way through the castle, like, oh my gosh, I love that episode. That episode is great. Also, I think they've lightened it. When it first came out, it was super dark, and I think they've lightened it since, because I saw every scene pretty vividly, so that's good. So those first 3 episodes are solid. Even episodes 4 and 5, though it's a bit rushed, like Dany turning mad. So Daenerys ends up turning evil, spoiler alert, even though I love her. She ends up turning evil and blowing up basically all of King's Landing with a bunch of innocent people and setting fire with her dragon to a bunch of innocent people. Now, in the first time I watched it, I was like, what happened? She has been solid. She's been consistently like the best person on this show, the best character, my favorite, that's my queen. And then in rewatching it, I can kind of see these little cracks of like, maybe that's not what you should be doing, girl. She also punishes Tyrion a lot for making these simple mistakes. I mean, some of Tyrion's mistakes, I'm like, bro, what are you doing? Look out for your queen. He forgets that Cersei Lannister is evil and just accepts that she's probably not going to help them in the fight. Hey, that's your fault. You said you'd take that on. Hey, that's your fault. You should be punished for that. I understand Dany going off on him on that. But then when she like burns people who don't bend the knee, I mean, she was pretty clear about her instructions. I mean, I'm defending women's wrongs. But like, I'll defend Dany's wrongs. I'll defend some women's wrongs, okay? Sometimes you just have to burn the Tarly brothers. Sometimes you just have to. They didn't bend the knee. Burn them. Burn them! Also, he was such a dick to his son, Sam. So, like, burn him. I don't care. I don't care. Also, the son's name is Dickon. What? Okay, another thing. When I rewatched it, seasons 6, 7, and 8, much funnier than the first 5. I think the writers were definitely putting in a lot more humor, and it's just a different vibe. Like, the end of the series is a much different vibe than the first couple seasons, and I think a lot of people were attached to the vibe of the first seasons, which I understand. They are great. I definitely also think the later seasons are much more modern. And so even House of the Dragon and like The Witcher, a lot of the fantasy series now are modeled more after the later seasons of Game of Thrones. They'll have humor and it's pretty fast paced. It's less about the travel and the journey and more about like the action and the fighting, which I don't think Game of Thrones necessarily places more emphasis on that. I just think the storytelling plays such a big part in the first couple seasons, and then towards the end, Game of Thrones starts to value more like the costumes and the set pieces and the battles and the big things, whereas the subtle storytelling was much more valued in the earlier seasons. And I think now with fantasy series, it's much more centered around the big set pieces, big actors in the new series, and the big fight scenes. Which there is definitely time and place for that. I don't know if people wanted to see Game of Thrones evolve into that. They wanted to stay true to the storytelling. Unfortunately, the character that's most affected by this is Daenerys. Daenerys starts out as this beacon of hope, this breaker of chains, of course, the mother of dragons, and she kind of loses her epicness as the series goes on. They do like to remind us that she's the baddest bitch occasionally, but we were getting reminders every episode in seasons 1 through 4. We're like, okay, we are rooting for this girl over and over again. And so it's so sad in the last 2 seasons is when you start to see the little cracks in Daenerys. And then by the end, I do see much more what they were going for of like her descent into madness. I just think they needed to spend more time with her. Even we see she's like isolated herself for 2 weeks. We see none of that. We see none of her being isolated by herself and like tormenting herself. We just see Tyrion check in on her once and then she's about to go mad. That's it. And so, I don't know. I think they definitely could have spent more time with Daenerys' downfall specifically. I also think they could have spent more time. The last episode of the series, I just felt so disappointed. Because even like I said, season 8, episodes 1 through 3, solid. And even episodes 4 and 5, I think are pretty good and like really well shot. The cinematography is amazing. Episode 6, it's just like, pew. They have Bran as the leader of the Seven Kingdoms. It makes no sense. Can't have any children, one. I mean, choosing a ruler sounds good, which is what they ended up doing. But also, it's kind of dumb to just sit there and be like, well, let's pick a leader. There was no lead up to that. They just trust Tyrion, the prisoner, to make the decision for them. Bran is also quoted earlier in the season to be like, I'm never going to lead anything. I'm not meant to be a lord. I'm the three-eyed raven. Oh, that's why I came here. To lead the fucking Seven Kingdoms? That's why you came there? Okay, Bran. Okay. Also, Bran, literally, as soon as he leaves Winterfell, I don't give a fuck. I don't care. Like, I could not care less for a single character. Bran, shut up! Shut up, Bran. There's literally nothing interesting you have to say. Ugh. Oh my gosh, that was so annoying. He pissed me off for the rest of the series. Samwell Tarly, I love him. I did get a little bit bored of him and Gilly. I'm so sorry. You know who, the people I was invested in by the end, it was Jon Snow. I ended up liking him so much more. The first time I watched it, I was like, well, it's just the Captain America prototype or whatever. But he was really a good leader. He was a great person. He was a great brother to his sisters. He just had honor with him the entire time. He was like, if Ned Stark was a bit smarter, that's Jon. And so, loved. I really, really liked Jon the second time watching it. I loved Daenerys. I loved Sansa, I loved Arya. Even Cersei and Jaime, I was very invested in their storylines. It was like, the Dorne sisters, I don't care. Bran, I don't care. Sam and Gilly, I like, but also, please stop showing them so much, I'm so bored. So, there was definitely certain storylines that I liked so much better the second time watching. I loved Stannis' storyline. The first time I was like, get him off my screen. But Stannis was kind of cool until the end when he literally went crazy and burned his daughter. Yeah, that wasn't good. And Shireen, Dragon Scale Queen, so mad, so mad. And the Red Woman, hate to say it, she served cunt. She came, she served, she died. That was it. That was like all she did. Loved her, even though she was a horrible person. I also really liked Tyrion up until the last 2 seasons. Tyrion really, really grew on me. Him and Varys, I was always kind of sketched out at first, but they make it pretty clear that they're heroes, and even though they've got their problems, they definitely were heroes of the realm until about season 7. Then I was kind of like, what's happening? That's what So many characters just ended up dissolving into caricatures of themselves, whereas they were very much being built up in the earlier seasons, and so that's what I didn't like about the ending. Jaime Lannister, a lot of people hated that he went back to Cersei. I think it's pretty clear throughout the entire show that he's going to end his life with Cersei. At the end of the day, that's what he's going to do. Maybe it was a bit rushed in the end, but also I never doubted that he loved Cersei the most. That's who he wanted to be with. I never doubted that Jon Snow was... If anything, Jon Snow stabbing Daenerys was much more of a shock the second time I watched it, because it was so rushed the first time I watched it, and then the second time I was like, okay, I understand the motivation, but yeah, they just had one episode to do that, and I was like, why didn't you stretch that out? That could have been a great storyline if you just made it a lot more tense and like wrote more material for it. Him killing Daenerys just doesn't make sense out of the blue. He's just like, all right, she's my queen forever. Boom, done. Boom, baddie down, baddie down. The second dragon dying was also like, I hate whenever the dragons die. That's like my least favorite. The dragons and the wolves, that's the worst. Okay, I've talked so much about Game of Thrones. Let me dive right into the article and then we'll make sense of all of what I've just said. One of the realizations I had while watching for the second time Game of Thrones was that a lot of the characters don't really change throughout the series. It's just they go through more and more suffering, which appeals to the audiences as like they're going through trauma, so some people would resonate with the trauma and some people would also continue to then root for their character, or if they weren't rooting for them before, after they see them endure trauma, they were rooting for them after the trauma. And I thought that was a really interesting show tactic because I guess normally when people are watching TV shows, you assume the good people are good, the bad people are bad, and it's because of the decisions that they make or the behaviors that they have that we either put them in good or bad. Especially in a fantasy show where it's good versus evil, you're constantly trying to decide who is in the good category and who is in the bad. And normally shows are pretty straightforward about it, but Game of Thrones is very different. Game of Thrones gives you a bunch of people who maybe are good but with a lot of flaws, or are seen as villains but then show you a lot of sympathy towards the villain. And so it's interesting that we decide which characters we like, which characters we don't like, especially in a show of Game of Thrones where it's not so much their decisions that drive our opinions, but it's what happens to them that drives our opinions on the characters. And so I was trying to find a study that really fit with, as I was watching Game of Thrones, what I was thinking the entire time. So, the article I found is called More or Less Likeable: The Role of Behavior-Independent Events in the Disposition Formation Process. This is by Lucy Brown and her colleagues, published in the Media Psychology Journal of 2025. That's a lot of big words for basically saying what makes a character likable, and is it behavior or is it events that are completely separate from the character's behavior. So the purpose of the study was basically to talk about what I just talked about, that most shows will allow their characters to make a bunch of different decisions, and we decide how we feel about the characters based on the decisions that they make. Now, what if we only really see the characters endure different events or consequences? Does them enduring different events give us sympathy for the characters? Why do we think all TV shows and so many movies, when there's dead parents, they assume that gives us sympathy for the characters? I think it's starting to wear off. Like, people are so done seeing dead parents in TV shows and movies. It's like, I don't really have that much sympathy. It seems like everybody in TV has a dead mom or dead dad. So it's like, But regardless, shows are constantly trying to give you information to sympathize with certain different characters. And Game of Thrones likes to throw that for a loop. Like, what if we put this horrible character through the ringer? What are audiences going to think about them then? So can audiences also develop a positive feeling toward a character based solely on what happens to them, not just their choices? What if a character gets cancer, or someone wins the lottery, or if someone is unfairly treated, or if a character survives like a natural disaster? These are all behavior independent events, so they don't have to do with the character's behavior. It's just something happening to the character during the time of the show. So this study is really built around something called affective disposition theory, or I'm going to call it ADT. ADT argues that people enjoy stories by judging whether characters are good or bad, and then developing emotional attachments to certain characters, and then feeling satisfied when their favorite characters get what they want and their least favorite characters get punished for whatever they did. That's what people interpret as like how you make a good show, is having the good characters be good and rewarded and the bad characters be bad and punished, basically. So previous research from this has overlooked the possible influences of fortune or misfortune, and luck or victimization, and random life events. So what this media psychology article is trying to do is say, hey, it's a lot more complex than just their behavior. We need to factor in what events happen, because sometimes people just root for someone on TV or in movies because of what they've gone through. And that's what this research article is trying to prove. So the researchers investigated a bunch of different questions. A lot of the participants were online. They were primarily recruited through an online panel, and they were randomly assigned to different stories. So the researchers wrote a bunch of different stories with the same characters making the same decisions. However, those characters were placed, like different events had happened to those characters, but the behavior remains the same throughout all the stories. Now, the participants are judging how they feel about the certain characters simply by the one story that they receive. So all the audience members receive different stories. And in some stories, the character is rich and makes this decision, and some stories the character is victimized and then makes this decision, but the decision stays the same. So like I said, the independent variable is what the character experiences, and their dependent variable, or what the researchers are testing, is how the audiences feel about the character after they see them make these decisions under their circumstances. Now, misfortune increased liking. So if a character had gone through the ringer, despite them making some questionable choices, audiences ended up rooting for the character because of how much trauma that they went through, or the events that they were put through if it was not fortunate. The positive fortune sometimes reduced sympathy. So a lot of the participants had less sympathy for, even if it was a hero, a heroic action. If he was born into a fortunate family, audiences were a lot less sympathetic, a lot less emotionally compelled to root for this character simply because of them being born into good circumstances and having good things happen to them. Good fortune did not necessarily increase audience affection. In fact, it actually reduced sympathy. So suffering created a lot of emotional investment for characters, and the characters facing a lot of hardship became psychologically a lot easier to root for. Now, there's a lot of different findings from this article that are really cool. I'm just going to go over the main ones because I did think there was some research limitations, like all the scenarios were fake, and the characters' experiences and the stories that they wrote about in the research were very simple. So it'd be much cooler to get a study of something like Game of Thrones when we see this played out in real time. Also, a lot of the participants had to make short-term judgments about the characters that they read about, whereas Game of Thrones is a show that you are invested for 8-10 years before you really see what happens to the characters in the very end. There's also some cultural differences. It's very Western. This whole research is very Western media, and so people from other cultures may interpret luck and fairness and suffering very differently. So I wanted to note that, but some of the key takeaways from the study was that behavior is not the only factor shaping audiences' attitudes towards fictional characters. Crazy, but also makes sense. Undeserved suffering reliably increased sympathy and likability, something we're about to talk about a bunch with Game of Thrones. Good fortune alone does not necessarily make characters more appealing. In fact, it made people reduce sympathy for those characters. Audience judgments combine morality with the perception of fairness and vulnerability with each character. The findings broaden when we introduce ADT, suggesting that emotional responses depend on both what characters do and what happens to them. Interesting. Now, after reading all of that, let's lock into Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones, if anything, is just this research psychology study done for 10 years. It's like, how can we put our characters through the most amount of suffering ever, and then we'll do the payoffs in the end? Which also, I feel like, even watching it through, we're still seeing characters endure through season 6. It's not until season 7 when the characters actually start making decisions and their behavior starts becoming out in front. Whereas I feel like more of what happens to the characters and the events that are happening to the characters just end up being reasons to hate, such as Joffrey psychologically torturing Sansa. Sansa didn't really have a choice in the matter, and we end up just hating Joffrey and rooting for Sansa, but it's not because of anything that Sansa does, it's just because she's endured so much from the psychological torture of Joffrey. Now, I think this is one of the main reasons that Game of Thrones became such a cultural phenomenon, is because we root for characters who go through so much. We see the Stark family be absolutely torn apart. The oldest son marries and then gets killed immediately with his newborn child in his wife's belly. The mom and the dad of the Stark family are both killed by Walder Frey and then the Lannisters. We see all of the Stark spread out. Sansa is psychologically tortured by Joffrey and then by Ramsay and then sold to Tyrion. She is constantly going through it. Arya is going to the Faceless Man and learning how to become an assassin. And Jon Snow goes up to the wall and is put through torture through the head of the Night's Watch, and then he goes up to the north and sees the woman he loves die right in front of him. So it's like we see our characters go through it over and over and over again. And sure, some of them are very noble. I think Jon acts like a hero throughout the series. Arya sometimes acts like a hero, but a lot of times she just wants to kill people. And so she's a little bit morally questionable. Sansa almost never makes a decision until season 6, when she finally can speak up for herself. And Bran is off to, I don't care. Bran does whatever he wants, and then he's fine in the end, clearly. But even then, it's like, I didn't really see Bran go through much suffering other than being crippled in the end. He kind of just gets these cool powers and then sees all of space and time. Also, the acting is really bad from him, in my opinion, in particular. So it's like, I don't really root for him at all, whereas I'm rooting for Jon, Arya, and Sansa throughout the entire thing. But it's probably because I've been seeing them with the suffering. They've been suffering the entire series. And so when they finally get a good payoff, I'm like, finally, I get to hope for them. One of the biggest misconceptions about Game of Thrones that I wanted to point out is that it's really not about heroes. It's seen as a story of good versus evil, but really it's a song about ice and fire, which there's evil parts to the ice and there's evil parts to the fire. If we're talking about Jon Snow and Daenerys, almost everyone in Westeros is very morally compromised. So Ned Stark is a character that very much taught us that the rules of Westeros don't matter. You can follow the rules, you can be honorable, but if you're not smart about who you tell your information to, you're probably gonna die, like Ned Stark. The moment that permanently bonds audiences to Ned Stark isn't really his morality, it's him being beheaded in front of his 2 daughters. That's what makes us rooting for the Stark family, is because he was unfairly treated. It's not because of anything he did and his moral compass, it's because it seemed very unfair the way that he died, especially in front of his daughters. Now, Tyrion Lannister is a different case scenario because we have a lot of sympathy for him before he's heroic. So he starts off very drunk, he's with whores, he's kind of doing his own thing, he's very much discarded by his family. But then we see that he's actually a smart guy, and we start to have sympathy because his family treats him horribly. His sister hates him and wants him dead. His father hates him and wants him dead. His brother kind of likes him. They're kind of friends. But ultimately, the brother's going to choose the sister and the dad over Tyrion anyway. And so we start to judge Tyrion's behavior at first, but then we're like, oh, he's had it pretty rough. And we end up rooting for him for the rest of the series. Now, Sansa is the ultimate victim, I think, there's Sansa and Theon in particular are the 2 ultimate victims of the show. Sansa, they put through hell as she goes through these different marriages, and she just starts the show at like 12, and she's psychologically tortured by an 18-year-old boy, and then she's sold off to Ramsay Bolton, who then rapes her and causes her more psychological torment. She finally is able to break free of this, and she even gets her revenge on Ramsay, which is great. But I don't even think it's anything that Sansa does in particular. It's just the fact that she's gone through so much that we end up rooting for her in the end. Theon's a whole different case. I think Theon is one of those that's like, you want justice for him because of simply how much he was punished. He was an asshole in the beginning. The first 2 seasons, Theon is horrible. He's a horrible person. I hate the way he treats the women of the show in particular. I hate the way he's acting towards the Starks, who have raised him practically. And then he gets captured by Ramsay Bolton, and Ramsay tortures him for, I can't remember a television series that better depicts torture for like 4 seasons. He is with constant torture from Ramsay. He believes his name is Reek, blah, blah, blah. It's like immediate psychological, it's horrible. And so by the end, it's not anything that Theon does, it's just he was punished for way more than what was deserved. So I just hope that it works out for him in the end. Of course it doesn't, because it's Game of Thrones, and they just want to rip your heart out. and he's killed right in front of the Stark brother. Whatever. A lot of people were like, that's a fitting end. No! No, it's not! Theon and Yara were like my two favorites by the end. I really, really liked them. But Theon is one of those that the crime that he did in the beginning, he was punished way further than the crime needed to be punished. And then we want redemption for him because of how much suffering he went through. I know it seems like I'm hammering this point home, but that was basically my big takeaway from Game of Thrones, is that a lot of why we rooted for these characters and why it had the world in such a chokehold was because the writers were brilliant enough to put these characters through the worst psychological torment and see how it affected audiences. And audiences really resonated with it. Not the suffering per se, but they really rooted for their characters to get a happy ending in the end. Because of how much they went through, not because of their behavior. The counterpoint to this argument is Daenerys Targaryen. Daenerys Targaryen is an example of when suffering stops excusing the behavior. So, like I said in the beginning, we are really rooting for her. She is sold off to a random place to be a wife and to be raped by the Dothraki. By savages is what she called them. She is able to make the most of it. She becomes their queen. She rightfully steps into her place. She ends up falling in love with the guy who she was sold to. So she comes from a very powerless place and then comes into a lot of power with these dragons. And so we root for her over and over again. But as the series goes on, her suffering becomes less and less, and we see her on top of the game everywhere she goes. Then she starts imposing her authoritarian rule, and that's when we start to lose sympathy for her. Even though we had all this sympathy for her, she was our people's princess in the first couple seasons. By the end, we lose all of our sympathy for her, and I would say this is a fault of the writers, is that we don't even keep rooting for her. And so by the time she dies, we're just like, yeah, that had to happen. We see it coming from a mile away. And we're not even sad when she goes because she just murdered all those innocent people. I don't know. It would have been a much more tragic and hard-hitting ending if they had maybe made us feel for her in the very end, but I don't think they keep the narrative on her enough to feel sympathy for her death because they just want to villainize her in the end. I think Daenerys has done the biggest disservice by the writers, for sure. And Emilia Clarke has every right to be mad about that ending, because I would be if I was playing the baddest bitch in Westeros for a couple years and then they all of a sudden kill me off like I'm nothing because they want to write me off as crazy. Sure. I'd be mad. I'd be really, really mad. I'm still mad, actually. You know what? I'm mad. I am mad. Okay. So I would say Daenerys is the counterpoint. So if we don't see the character suffering and we just see them on top, then we have less forgiveness for where their actions go. All in all, Game of Thrones captivated audiences for 10 years. Think what you want about what the ending was and how the finale progressed, but regardless, it had everybody watching, and I wondered why. And I think it's because the characters that we ended up rooting for were not just because of their behaviors, but because of how much suffering we saw them endure. Game of Thrones is a perfect example of this in a show. It's a really cool social experiment to see how people were so attached and so emotionally invested in these characters. And yeah, I think it's a better show because of it, and the writers were so good for so long. It was a really great show to experience again. Loved it. If you haven't watched Game of Thrones, absolutely watch it. And if you want this article, I will link the article in the description below. But that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening to the Carpenter Critique. If you want to follow me on any social media platforms, I'm at the Carpenter Critique everywhere. But also, I'm Luke Carpenter. I'm your host. I hope to see you next week. Bye!